Welcome, GCSE students. Today's lesson, we're moving on to a new topic. This topic is psychology in sport, or sports psychology. It's one of the topics that we need to cover on the GCSE Edexcel exam. So what are we going to look at today? We're looking at types of feedback. It's a relatively straightforward lesson, but again, it's important to know this, just in terms of the course, but obviously in terms of your own performance and being able to relate this theory to what you do in your sports. So there are 4 different types of feedback, and today we're going to know what the 4 different types of feedback are. We're also going to understand some really good examples of each, and then be able to answer typical exam questions on types of feedback. So relatively straightforward. Let's move on with the lesson. So first of all, let us just try and understand what feedback actually means. You'll know about feedback after you do an exam or you do some sort of assessment. Well, in sport, we also use feedback a lot because it is information that we receive before, during, or after a performance about our performance, how we did. So really, really important to know that is about information that we receive before, during, or after performance that we can then act on and hopefully improve our performance and future performances. Now, there are 4 different types of feedback. These are the 4 that you need to know: intrinsic, extrinsic, concurrent, and terminal. They're the 4 that you need to know. So maybe you want to spend some time just trying to remember these. Intrinsic and extrinsic, probably you will be able to understand and pin that to some knowledge that you've got already. But concurrent and terminal may be new ideas that you learn from in this lesson. Now, I do try and provide memory aids, and here's one that I decided. Inside every top coach, so each of those letters corresponds to one of those 4 types of feedback. Inside, obviously intrinsic, every, extrinsic, concurrent is coach, and terminal is top. So inside every top coach, if you can remember that, it might make it easier for you to recall these 4 types of feedback. What would be very useful now at this stage, if you're watching this on YouTube or you're following it on one of the Microsoft forms that I do for the lessons, it'd be very useful if you made a table with your ruler in your books so you can just jot down the key points about intrinsic feedback and extrinsic feedback. These are the first 2 types of feedback that we're going to look at today. So if you need to pause the video, just create that table. This will really, really help you with your revision notes before your exam. So let's first of all start with intrinsic feedback. Now, very, very important at this point to just think about the word intrinsic. It obviously has in at the beginning of it, so we think about it's inside the performer. So this comes from the performer themselves. So, for example, you say to yourself after performing some sort of skill in whatever sport it is that you do, whether that's tennis or golf or table tennis, football, that feeling that you get, that initial information after you perform that skill. Let's say it was a volley, a corner came over and you volleyed it. As soon as you connected with it, you felt, yeah, that was a good connection. I struck that ball well. This is information that you are giving to yourself and reflecting on your own performance. So that is why intrinsic is so important. A key word alert here, really, really impressive if you can mention the word kinesthetic, or the feeling, the feel of performing a particular skill. So if you could bring that into one of your answers later on or in your GCSE exam, that would definitely impress an examiner. Now, second thing I want you to understand is that when we think about how we performed in a match, in a particular skill, maybe a penalty shootout, and we reflect on that, that information that we are giving ourselves is also intrinsic feedback. We're thinking about our performance and then hopefully being able to act on it. So we got a picture here of Tyson Fury, obviously feeling very motivated after this fight. Um, so that self-talk that we give ourselves, that internal feedback that we give ourselves, can be very motivating, particularly when we perform well and we get that feeling as we come back home from playing a football match. Maybe you got man of the match or you scored a couple of goals or a hat trick. That feeling that motivates you because you reflect and you actually feel proud maybe of the performance that you put in. And think about the flip side. Maybe you've had an absolute shocker where you haven't played particularly well. You were just off, your coordination was off, your first touch was off, your accuracy of passing was not very good, and you also give that information back to yourself again. Now, this can maybe demotivate, I should say, some people, or in fact, some people might use that to maybe get out and get on the training pitch a little bit earlier and stay a little bit later. So it can act in both ways when you connect this feedback to the motivation of athletes as well. Something to consider. And lastly, intrinsic feedback obviously does not come from an external source. There's no coach involved in this. There's no buddy that's giving you advice on how you performed in that task. So for that reason, when we think about novices, and novice is just another um, term for a real beginner in a sport, this intrinsic feedback is not really that useful because we just don't know enough about the sport. We haven't got enough experience about the sport or those skills or techniques that we're performing in. So it's useful to know um, that it's not as useful if you are a novice. In those situations, you need a coach. Think about um, somebody, a good example would be somebody learning to swim. Now, you're not going to be able to jump in and then, just talk yourself through and get a feeling for how to perform the correct breaststroke or front crawl or butterfly stroke. You do need a coach that's there to give you the pointers and the technique that will help you to improve. So that is very, very important too. So let's have a little think about extrinsic. Now, as I showed you beforehand, extrinsic has the X at the beginning. So we know that it's talking about an external source. So that's the way that we can categorize these two different, very different types of feedback. External comes from somebody outside of yourself. It's not intrinsic, it's not internal feedback that you give to yourself. So that is really the first point that you need to know. It comes from an outside source, such as a coach. It can motivate us to improve and continue to practice. We all love a little bit of praise. We all love being told when we do things well. So in this case, it can definitely motivate us to continue to improve, continue to practice. And sometimes if a coach says, listen, you didn't really perform. I know you can do a lot better. You're going to have to do better next game. That can also motivate you to put the graft in on the training pitch and those hours that we need to put in to kind of master our craft and master our sport and sporting techniques. So it goes without saying that it can come from a coach, but this is a key point that you need to know. That's what coaches are paid to do, whether you're a personal trainer, whether you're a boxing coach, football coach, gymnastics coach, they are experts and can be able to identify the things that you need to do and give that um, excellent feedback that will move your performance on. But it can also come from other sources. It can come from your teammates, maybe your family and friends, or if you play at that level, it can come from the spectators and the crowd that's watching you play. So they are the extrinsic feedback sources. Important to know. Take some time to just have a little think about that and go over it. I thought it would be useful just to pick a couple of sporting examples that can just highlight what we mean by intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. We got two pictures here. We got a picture of Rory McIlroy, good Irish golfer, striking a ball from the fairway. Beautiful golf course by the looks of it. And then down the bottom we have another Irishman Roy Keane, who was captain of Manchester United, one of the clubs that he captained, he was captain of a few others. But we've got Roy Keane, and we'll talk through this in a minute. But let's just start with the golfer. Okay, so golfer, he's striking the ball. I want you to think about as he actually strikes that ball in the process of him performing this technique, this skill, this quite complex skill. As soon as he strikes that, he'll be thinking to himself, how did I swing? What was the contact like with the ball? All that information is being fed back to him. All that kinesthetic information is being fed back to him. So let's imagine that he hits a shot and immediately after striking that, he feels like he got a great connection with the golf club on the golf ball. So he feels that he performed the skill well, and he tells himself, that self-talk that we do as athletes, that he will do exactly the same next time. Okay, keep the swing the same, keep the contact the same, keep your head down, do all the things that you did this time in the next shot. So that is intrinsic feedback, that feedback that's coming from within the athlete. So intrinsic, good example, this golfer. Now let's think about the extrinsic side. So we're thinking about Roy Keane here, captain of Manchester United. Now, as we said, extrinsic feedback comes from an outside source. We know that it can be a coach. That's the obvious one. But also we mentioned that it can be your teammates, and in this case, your captain of your football team. So let's imagine this scenario. You're a wing back, let's say you're right wing back, and you play a bad pass, you give possession away to the other team, and you did not track back. So you lost possession, maybe you dropped your head, you didn't just sprint back and give 100% to get back in position and win that possession back. Now, after that, your captain, in this case Roy Keane, quite a scary man at times, lets you know that this is not good enough, to put it mildly. You will take that feedback from an external source, in this case your captain. You then make sure that this will not happen again. You don't want to let your captain down, you don't want to let your teammates down. So it does motivate you to put more effort in next time. Make sure that if you do hit an accurate pass, you're going to do everything in your capability to get back and get that possession back for your team. So just two examples there of intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. So again, let's just go through some key points that I really, really want you to take away from this. These are the key takeaway points. So let's go through. Intrinsic feedback, we know, comes from the performer themselves, from you as you play a sport, giving yourself that information. You think about how you performed, how well they performed. If you didn't perform, what do you need to do? If you did, how can you keep on doing that? How can you improve even more next time? So you think about the skill and your overall performance, maybe after the game. Um, in reference to the skill there, maybe you have, let's just pick basketball for an example, and you have just taken a free throw and you absolutely got it wrong, and you think to yourself straight away, well, why did I get that wrong? Why didn't I? I've done this 100 times, thousands of times in practice. What went on there? And it's that self-reflection. Maybe you didn't follow through when you threw the basketball. It can motivate you if you feel you perform well, and vice versa. If you feel you didn't perform well, it may motivate you, but may demotivate you as well. And that's something that we have to understand. And this is very, very important. And in fact, you're going to apply this in one of the exam questions later on. It's not as useful if you are a novice. So a beginner, an absolute beginner, you're not confident, you don't have the experience. And in this case, you need a coach. So you need that extrinsic feedback, external feedback. Let's look at the other side. So extrinsic, ultimately, it means it comes from an outside source, not from you, the performer, from an outside source. It can motivate you to improve, continue to practice. It can be from a coach, teammates, family and friends, possibly even the crowd, the spectators. Now, here's an exam style question. So how are we going to apply what we now know about the 4 different types of feedback to an exam question? This one here is just asking you to explain the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic feedback. So what I'm going to ask you to do here is possibly pause the video for a few minutes, possibly give yourself 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, and see how you get on with this. Press play again, and I'll go through some suggestions, a little checklist on what you might have done when you answered that question. So hopefully you're back with us, and now we can go through some of the points that could show you what success looks like when trying to tackle this 4-mark question. So intrinsic comes from within. Let's straight away just say, I know the difference and I know what intrinsic is. It comes from within the performer themselves. Whereas extrinsic comes from an outside source, such as a coach and teammate. So I've also given examples of external factors, external people that can give us that feedback as well. Intrinsic is useful with elite or experienced athletes. That's important. And then also, this is the key point that I've been trying to make, novices or beginners will need a coach if they don't have the knowledge to evaluate their own performance and make those small adaptations that we always make as we're performing a skill. So give yourself a tick there, give yourself marks on that question out of 4 marks. How did you get on? Right, it might be useful now at this stage to, again, just with your ruler, with a table, and in your books, make a table with these 2 columns. Concurrent feedback we're going to look at, and terminal feedback. So give yourself a couple of minutes to draw out this table so you can then just write in your notes as we move through the next few slides. So here we go. Concurrent and terminal feedback. Well, let's start off with concurrent. Now, the word concurrent just means at the same time. So knowing that, you know that, and from the picture here, you can see that we've got 2 football managers or 2 coaches that are, during the match, giving the feedback to their players. In-game feedback. So concurrent feedback is given at the time of the performance. So for example, a coach from the sideline during a match, we've all experienced that. Anybody that's played for a team, your coach is telling you what to do during the match. Great thing about this type of feedback is you can act upon it immediately. So maybe it's some tactics that you need to act upon. Maybe it's an immediate improvement to your own performance or your own motivation that you need. So concurrent just means at the time of the performance. Terminal feedback, you can see from the image here, we have Pep Guardiola, Man City manager, in the dressing room, possibly after the match. Terminal, the word terminal just means at the end. So at the end of the match. It can also be half time because that half has finished and you're in the changing room. But it's feedback that happens afterwards. So feedback given at the end of a game or a performance. Now that performance might be a particular skill that you've just performed and you're getting feedback after that. But a good example is after the match in the dressing room, let's go through, let's analyze the game, what happened. This sort of feedback has the benefit of being more reflective and giving an overview of the whole performance. That chance to reflect on it, analyze, evaluate what happened, and then get some really good feedback on the performance. So there's the next 2 different types of feedback. And that's all 4 that you covered now. So let's run through these. Concurrent feedback. What are the key takeaway points that we need to get from this? Well, it's given at the time of the performance, the coach from the sideline. This sort of feedback can be acted upon immediately. Very, very important. Terminal is given at the end of a game or a performance. Gives a review of how you have just performed, and terminal feedback is best when it's you don't wait a week to get the team together to talk about the match. The less time that passes between the performance and this feedback, this overall feedback, it has more impact. So this is directly from a GCSE exam question. Extrinsic and intrinsic feedback are used when performing in sport. Assess the relative importance of each of these types of feedback to a group of people who have just started learning to swim. Now, there's a lot of information in this question here that we definitely need to zoom in on. And if you think about, first of all, what is it asking you to do? What is this question asking you to do? And I'm just going to, because I do like to get you to bug the question. So if we go assess the relative importance of each. That's what it's asking you to do. It's asking you to assess, to make a judgment on which is more important between extrinsic and intrinsic. So that is ultimately what the question, and we have to tackle that in the answer. You have to say this one's more important than that one. That's what the examiner is waiting to see that you've put in this question. Now also we need to then, I like to get you to underline. So Bug is put a box around the key term, what it's asking you to do, and then underline. So obviously extrinsic and intrinsic feedback are part of this question. So we need to know that. But there's some other key information that's given in the question. Feedback for people who have just started to learn to swim. Just started to learn to swim. So we know that they are novices, they are beginners, and swimming is quite a complex skill and a high level of danger, I suppose, involved in it as well. So now that we have bugged that, and we look at extrinsic feedback, so feedback that comes from an outside source. Okay, is that going to be important for novices? Or do they know it already? Can they just self-correct? Can they make those adaptations because they've got loads of experience? Well, in this case, we know they're just learning to swim. So when we ask ourselves the question, which is going to be more important, straight away we think, coming from an outside source, this feedback is going to be more impactful. So we know we're going to say that extrinsic is more important. Now I'm just going to show you how I modeled out the extrinsic paragraph. And then I'm going to ask you to try and do the intrinsic feedback paragraph itself. Again, 3 marks for each. Let's have a look at what I put. So, a beginner will require extrinsic feedback. I'll put in brackets is more important. Just ultimately that sentence there is saying that it is more important. But you may want to use those words just to signpost to the examiner that you are attacking the question and making that assessment. Because they lack confidence. So you're explaining why now. These people that are learning to swim, they lack confidence in their performance, in those skills, not just in being in the water if you can't swim, as they are new to the activity. Okay, that's good. That will get you your first mark. So you definitely have that first mark in the bag there. Now, again, you will know that I'm constantly banging on about using these phrases. This means that, and as a result. So let's go. This means that they will require extrinsic feedback from a coach. Another mark, talking about where this feedback is going to come from a coach. Now we have to double develop. It's lasting for 3 marks, so we have to go again. As a result, this will motivate or encourage or confirm what they are doing is correct in order to develop their skills and techniques. So they need that confirmation from an outside source because they're the expert and these people do not have the experience, the knowledge to be able to do that themselves. So that is a really, really good question where I've attacked and got those 3 available marks. So over to you now, and if you're doing this in my class on Microsoft Form, there will be a question down below on the Microsoft Form where it's asking you to just now tackle the intrinsic side. So you will be saying that intrinsic is less important or is not as useful is a nice way to put it for a novice swimmer that's just learning how to swim. So you want to say intrinsic, on the other hand, is not as important or not as effective, and go on to give those reasons why. But that would be a good start.